Paul Murphy.
Thanks, Las Count Corla. I'm going to be brief, following my colleague Deputy Barry, and this will be the last speaking slot that Solidarity People for Profit will take in the second stage debate, because we're very anxious to see this legislation progressed and come into effect as soon as is possible, particularly in light of the quite precarious situation that the government is in. So just a few brief general points and two specific points to complement what Deputy Barry said. The first is obviously to register the absolutely historic nature of this legislation that we're debating and what a victory it represents, not for any of the establishment parties, but of a movement and of all those who fought over decades, and in particular since the death of Savita, for precisely or for large elements of this legislation. Those who did it are those who marched, those who organised, those who mobilised, those who canvassed, those who distributed and made accessible the abortion pills, which showed that the existing legislation could no longer hold, and of course all of those who came out to vote. The scale of the victory is seen by contrasting the kind of debate that would have been taking place a year or 2 years ago, which would have seen this legislation as being completely unrealistic, as being the legislation of radicals, whereas in fact it's legislation far more in line with the international norms than the restricted legislation that was anticipated in the earlier stages of the debate. Up until a year ago, all of the discussion was around fatal fetal abnormalities, was around rape, and possibly seen as the most developed position, possibly on a health-only grounds. And those of us who were fighting for the right to choose were seen as being, absolutely off the wall and in danger of jeopardising the possibility of repeal of the Eighth Amendment. And so this really is an historic victory, and it's a very important step to the full right of women to choose. It's a victory, on the one hand, for those sections of the population which mobilised, in particular women, young people, LGBTQ people. It's also a defeat for the conservative forces in this state, who believed, or like to pretend to believe, that they had a silent majority on their side, which clearly they didn't. It's a defeat for the Catholic Church, and it leads to all of the other struggles that are needed for a full separation of church and state in this country, taking the church out of education, taking the church out of health, and providing those as public services free of church influence or control, while of course respecting the right of everybody to practice whatever religion that they want. It's also part of a global struggle. It's part of a global women's struggle that has emerged particularly strongly in the last number of years, which had its counterpart in massive protests taking place in Argentina, fighting for abortion rights, where unfortunately the Conservatives held on and won the vote in the Senate, but where that movement is regrouping, will grow again, and will ultimately win a victory there. It has its counterpart elsewhere in Latin America, in Brazil, where you have an all-out struggle now of women, of workers, of left organisations to try and defeat the possibility of this far-right candidate Bolsonaro coming to power in the presidential elections, and we send our solidarity to all those involved in that struggle at the moment. I just want to raise two specific issues for the government to respond on in terms of the legislation. And they are issues that relate to the more oppressed sections of the population that will be seeking to access abortion under this legislation when it comes into being. The first is, and it seems to me on a reading of the legislation very problematic, is trans men and non-binary people who are seeking to access abortion. The definition provided in the bill says woman, and it's woman is used throughout the course of the bill in terms of who can access abortion. It says woman means a female person of any age. and that, when read in conjunction with the Gender Recognition Act, will create, seems to me, a real problem, where trans men have the capacity to become pregnant, as do non-binary people, but certainly under a strict reading of that bill would be unable to access abortion. I'd like to hear what the response of the government is to that, whether they accept that there is a legal problem presented there, or even if they say no, there's no legal problem there, it will be covered, etc. In any case, to use trans and non-binary inclusive language there to simply replace woman with pregnant person throughout the bill. The second point relates to the issue of criminalisation, because the 14-year criminal sentence for those who assist people in accessing abortions outside of the framework of this bill will remain in place. And that's contrary to the recommendation of the committee on the outcome of the Citizens' Assembly and the 8th Amendment. And it's contrary to what is international good practice, for two reasons. One being that the existence of that 14-year prison sentence, which is, a hangover from the 8th Amendment and the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act. It's very draconian, 14-year prison sentence. That will act to provide, as a chilling effect, on doctors who are operating even within the framework of this piece of legislation, because they might be very concerned, for example, that they're going over the 12 weeks or so on, and it will inhibit them in their actions. The second is it'll criminalise those, for example, a friend, a relative, etc., who are assisting someone in a crisis pregnancy situation, accessing, for example, an abortion outside the framework of this legislation. It's only the case that reckless, very dangerous abortion should be criminalised, which is criminalised as under just as reckless medical procedure or whatever would currently be criminalised, and that it seems to me to be very, very dangerous to maintain this as it currently is. And so I would say to the government that they should follow the advice of international experts, they should follow the advice of the Committee on the 8th Amendment, and have decriminalisation of abortion and whatever new law is necessary in terms of that.